My name is Isabel Nicholson. At 27, I am a captain in the United States Army. I was trained to identify an enemy from a mile away, to analyze the most sophisticated deception. But I spent my entire life pretending not to see the biggest enemy of all, living under my own roof. On the day of my wedding, at a magnificent Newport mansion overlooking the sea, my father, General Harrison Nicholson, stepped forward. In front of generals, admirals, and my own comrades in arms, he leaned in close, his voice a venomous hiss. You think wearing a white dress and marrying a real soldier can hide the fact that you're just a desk-bound disappointment? And then, he punched me. A deliberate soldier's punch that sent me sprawling onto the marble floor, blood staining the corner of my veil. He thought that public humiliation would break me, force me back under his control for good. But he miscalculated one thing. He didn't know that in the dead silence that followed, another vow was being made. Not to my husband, but to myself. If you've ever had to make yourself small to keep the peace in your family, let me know where you're from. Press the like and subscribe button, because this story is proof that even the longest silence can find its roar. The moments before the fall were perfect. Almost unnaturally so. We were at the Breakers, the grandest of the Newport mansions, a gilded age palace built to project power and untouchable wealth. The air inside the great hall, a cavernous space with ceilings so high they seemed to belong to the sky, was thick with the scent of lilies and old money. A string quartet played softly in a corner, the delicate notes of a harp barely rising above the polite, controlled murmur of the nation's military elite. Outside, the manicured lawns rolled down to meet a calm, slate-gray Atlantic. I remember holding a flute of Veuve Clicquot, the tiny bubbles rising in a frantic celebratory dance. My own happiness felt just like that, a fragile, shimmering thing that might vanish if I looked at it too closely. It was a feeling I knew well, a lifelong habit of holding my breath, terrified that any sudden exhale might shatter the illusion of peace my family worked so hard to maintain. Around me, the men stood ramrod straight in their dress uniforms, chests heavy with medals that glinted like armor in the soft afternoon light filtering through the towering arched windows. Their wives, elegant and poised, moved through the crowd with practiced grace. It was a perfect picture, meticulously composed. A portrait of the Nicholson family legacy. And I, for the first time, felt like I was finally a part of it, not just a disappointing footnote. My husband, Jack, stood beside me, his hand warm and steady on the small of my back. He was an anchor in this glittering, treacherous sea. He caught my eye and smiled, a genuine, easy smile that came from the cornfields of Wisconsin, so different from the tight, calculated expressions I grew up with. In that smile, I allowed myself to breathe. A mistake. That was when I saw my father, General Harrison Nicholson, making his way toward us. He moved not like a father of the bride, but like a commander reviewing his troops. Shoulders back, chin high, his 2 stars winking on his collar. A path cleared for him instinctively. Admirals nodded, colonels straightened their posture. He was a legend in the armored corps, a man carved from granite and fury, and the air crackled with his approach. He ignored Jack completely, his gaze fixed on me. His eyes, the same pale blue as a winter sky, were devoid of any warmth. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could smell the scotch on his breath, a scent I associated with closed-door rages and the splintering of furniture. He leaned in, and for a wild, hopeful second, I thought he was going to offer a word of congratulations, a grudging truce on my wedding day. That's when he uttered those words, a low hiss meant only for me, but sharp enough to slice through the surrounding chatter. You think wearing a white dress and marrying a real soldier can hide the fact that you're just a desk-bound disappointment? The world didn't go black. On the contrary, it went sharp. Painfully, horribly sharp. The sound of his knuckles connecting with my jaw was a dull, wet crack that seemed to silence the harp mid-note. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side, and I stumbled, my heel catching in the lace of my gown. The fall felt like it happened in slow motion, a graceful, horrifying arc that ended with the brutal impact of my body against the cold, unforgiving marble floor. A metallic taste, coppery and sharp, filled my mouth, mingling with the last sweet notes of the champagne. A single drop of blood landed on the pristine white of my veil. I lay there for a second, stunned, the cavernous hall spinning. And then I looked up. I saw it all. The faces. The shocked open mouths. The wide eyes of the catering staff. The awkward, pained expressions of my fellow officers. And worst of all, the averted gazes. The sudden, intense interest in shoes, in ceiling frescoes, in anything but the sight of a two-star general's daughter bleeding on the floor of her own wedding reception. These powerful men who had shaken my father's hand moments before, were now silent, immobile witnesses. Their silence was a verdict. In their world, a daughter's pain was a private matter, an inconvenience not worth risking the favor of a man like my father. Then, a flicker of movement. My mother, Eleanor, was rushing towards me, her silk dress whispering across the marble. A desperate, foolish hope surged in my chest. Mom! She would help me. She would fix this. She reached me, but she didn't kneel down. She didn't offer a hand. Instead, her fingers, cold and sharp, dug into my upper arm. A vice-like grip meant to haul me up. Her face was a mask of frantic panic, but her eyes held no concern for me, only for the scene I was creating. Isabel, she hissed, her voice a sliver of ice. What did you do to make him so angry, here, of all places? The question struck me with more force than the punch. It was a blow to my soul, a clean, precise stab that found the exact spot where I was most vulnerable. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. It was the theme of my entire life, the silent anthem of our family. Harrison's rage is a force of nature. Your job is to not provoke it. If you fail, the consequences are yours alone. In that one question, she confirmed everything I had always feared, that my pain was nothing compared to the inconvenience of his anger. The betrayal was absolute. But then, another presence was there. Jack. He knelt beside me, his body a solid shield between me and the horrified, judgmental eyes of the crowd. He gently touched my uninjured cheek, his gaze searching mine, full of a fury that was entirely on my behalf. He helped me to my feet, his arm a steel band around my waist, holding me steady as the world threatened to tilt again. He didn't look at my father with rage. He didn't shout. He straightened his own uniform, stood at his full height, and faced the general. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the suffocating silence of the great hall with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. General Nicholson, he said, his tone respectful but unwavering. Pursuant to Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, you have just committed assault upon a subordinate commissioned officer. There are more than 70 witnesses present. The world Jack had forced back into order at the wedding reception had dissolved by the time we reached the hotel. The adrenaline that had held me together, that had kept my spine straight and my eyes forward, drained away, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating silence. It was a silence I knew intimately. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was a presence. A heavy blanket woven from all the words never said, the praise never given, the apologies never offered. It was the silence of my childhood home in Newport, and it had followed me here. As Jack gently cleaned the cut on my cheek, the sting of the antiseptic was nothing compared to the sting of memory. That punch wasn't a beginning, it was a conclusion, the final explosive sentence in a story that had been written over 27 years. The story starts, as it always does, in my father's study. It wasn't just an office, it was a shrine. The room smelled of cherry wood polish, old leather, and an unshakable sense of masculine importance. One entire wall was what he called the Wall of Honor. It was a meticulously organized display of his entire career, the Distinguished Service Medal, the Silver Star. Framed photographs of him with presidents, his diplomas. It was a testament to a life of achievement. The opposing wall held a single object, a life-sized oil portrait of my older brother, Harrison Jr., who had died in a training accident before I was born. He was frozen in time at 22, handsome and confident in his West Point dress grays, the perfect son, forever perfect in death. And on the other two walls, nothing. Blank mahogany paneled space. There was no photograph of me at my officer candidate school graduation, no framed copy of my honors degree from Georgetown, no evidence that a daughter named Isabel even existed. I wasn't just overlooked in that room, I was erased. My entire life was a silent, desperate attempt to earn a single inch of space on those walls, to prove I was a worthy substitute for the ghost in the painting. My best chance, I thought, was West Point. It was his world, his alma mater. If I could walk the same paths, wear the same gray uniform, I could finally earn his respect. I worked relentlessly. I ran until my lungs burned, studied until the words blurred on the page, practiced for the congressional nomination interview until my answers were flawless. The interview was with a senior senator, an old friend of my father's. I was nervous, but prepared. And then my father, who had insisted on being there, leaned forward with a paternal smile. "Isabel has a tender heart, Senator," he said, his voice smooth as bourbon. "Perhaps that environment is a little too harsh for it." It sounded like concern, a father's love, but it was a perfectly aimed shot. The senator's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt entering his eyes. I saw my dream die in that moment, killed by a single, caring sentence. It took me years to understand it wasn't protection, it was sabotage. He never wanted me to be his equal. He wanted me to be a subject in his kingdom, not a contender for a neighboring throne. The rejections of who I was became more direct as I got older. When I was 16, I discovered photography. I loved the quiet magic of the darkroom, the way I could capture a moment and hold it. All I wanted for Christmas that year was a new camera, a Canon AE1 like the one Ansel Adams used. On Christmas morning, there was a large, heavy box for me under the tree. My heart hammered with hope. I tore it open, and my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a set of cast-iron dumbbells and a thick textbook, the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual. Tucked inside was a card in my mother's elegant script. Time to focus on more important things. The message was brutally clear. My passions, the things that made me me, were not important. They were frivolous distractions from the only path he deemed acceptable. Still, I tried. I joined the Army through a different route, chose military intelligence, a field he scorned as desk work. I excelled. The day I was promoted to captain, my new rank pinning ceremony felt hollow without them there. I called home from my office in D.C., my voice buzzing with pride. "Dad, I made captain." There was a pause, then his voice, flat and unimpressed. "All right." Click. The line went dead. That night, I put on a nice dress and went to the Capitol Grill by myself. I sat at a small table, ordered a perfectly cooked filet mignon, and a glass of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon I couldn't really afford. I raised my glass to my own reflection in the dark window. "Congratulations, Captain Nicholson," I whispered. I had never felt so proud and so profoundly, devastatingly alone. My greatest achievements were ghosts, celebrated only by me. When I first brought Jack home to Newport, I'd held a sliver of hope. Jack was a Green Beret, a Special Forces officer. He was, by any measure, a real soldier. He tried so hard to connect. At dinner, he brought up the Green Bay Packers, trying to find some common ground in the all-American religion of football. My father cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "In this house, Mr. Monroe," he said, the Mr. dripping with condescension, "we don't discuss games. We discuss war and legacy." Later that night, after Jack had gone, my father turned to me, his lip curled in a sneer. "You chose a simple farmer from Wisconsin. It just shows how low your standards are. He will never belong in this world." And now here I was, in a hotel room far from Newport, the silence screaming around me. My wedding dress, a symbol of a future I desperately wanted, lay in a heap on the floor, its white lace stained with my blood. I had changed out of it mechanically, my body moving on autopilot. Driven by years of instinct, I'd put on the only thing that felt like armor. My uniform. I stood before the full-length mirror, the dark green fabric feeling both familiar and foreign. I saw the silver bars of a captain on my shoulders, the polished insignia on my collar. I saw the reflection of a woman who had fought for every scrap of respect she'd ever received. But looking at the tired, bruised face staring back at me, a cold question finally surfaced from the depths. This uniform I fought so hard to earn. Is it armor that protects me, or is it just the walls of a prison he built? The question hung in the air of that sterile hotel room long after I'd asked it. Armor or prison? I didn't have an answer. The world my father had built was the only one I knew. A week later, I found myself on a plane, descending into a world I couldn't have imagined. On the flight to Madison, I'd been listening to a podcast, trying to drown out the noise in my own head. It was Brené Brown. I remember her voice, calm and steady, saying, "Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage." The words felt foreign, like a language I'd never been taught. Courage, in my world, was about hiding vulnerability, not embracing it. As the plane's wheels touched down, the first thing I noticed was the sheer, overwhelming green. It wasn't the manicured, restrained green of Newport's estates. It was a wild, sprawling, unapologetic green of cornfields stretching to the horizon under a vast, open sky. When the cabin door opened, the air that rushed in was different. It was clean and smelled of damp earth and growing things. It felt like I was taking my first real breath in 27 years. They were waiting at the gate, not with polite nods or hesitant handshakes, but with arms wide open. Jack's mother, Carol, a woman with laugh lines around her eyes and flour dusting her jeans, pulled me into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and safety. It wasn't the brittle, air-kiss embrace of my mother. It was a real, solid, enveloping hug. Jack's father, Frank, a tall, quiet man with hands weathered by decades of work, simply placed a large, warm hand on my shoulder and squeezed gently. It was a gesture that said more than 1,000 empty words of welcome ever could. In that small regional airport, surrounded by the genuine warmth of the Monroe family, I felt like an alien stepping onto a friendly planet for the first time. Frank's silence was the first thing that truly unnerved me. He was a man of few words, and my body, conditioned by years of living with my father, automatically interpreted a quiet, powerful man as a threat. I spent the first day on edge, waiting for the quiet to break, for the inevitable judgment or criticism. But it never came. The next morning, I woke before dawn, my internal clock still set to military time. I sat on the wide wooden porch swing, a mug of coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the mist rise off the fields. The screen door creaked open, and Frank stepped out. He didn't speak, just handed me a fresh, steaming mug. He sat down in the rocking chair beside me, the silence stretching between us. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. Peaceful. After a long moment, he nodded towards a line of trees at the edge of the property. "Deer come down to the creek to drink about this time," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. And that was it. He wasn't testing me or demanding a response. He was just sharing his world with me, a quiet, simple offering with no strings attached. My father's silence was a weapon. Frank's was a gift. Later that day, I found myself in the kitchen with Carol. The room was the heart of the house, warm and filled with the heavenly scent of yeast. It was Friday, which meant the traditional Wisconsin Friday fish fry, and she was preparing everything from scratch. As my hands, trained to break down a rifle, fumbled with peeling potatoes, she asked about my work. I launched into my default explanation, a mechanical, jargon-filled description of intelligence analysis and threat assessment. She listened patiently, then gently stopped my hands with her own. "My goodness, that sounds stressful," she said, her expression full of genuine concern. And then she asked the question that shattered my defenses. "Does it make you happy, Izzy?" I just stared at her. Happy? No one had ever asked me that. They asked about my metrics, my promotion potential, my performance reviews. Happiness was never part of the equation. For the first time, I spoke about the crushing pressure, the sleepless nights, but also the thrill of solving a complex puzzle. I spoke not as Captain Nicholson, but as myself. While we talked, she was tending to a bowl of sourdough starter. "The secret to good bread is patience," she said, folding the dough with expert hands. "You have to give it time and space to rise, dear. People are like that too." Her simple words, spoken in the warmth of that Wisconsin kitchen, held a profound wisdom my own mother, with all her society breeding, had never offered. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I was lying in bed, my mind racing, trying to process the day's kindness. It felt too good to be true, and I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jack, sensing my restlessness, pulled me close. He tucked my head under his chin and whispered into my hair, "You don't have to perform here, you know. You don't have to earn their approval. They already love you." His words were the permission I'd been waiting for my entire life. Permission to just be. Permission to exhale. In that moment, I realized the Monroes were becoming my safe harbor, the family I had chosen, not the one I was born into. The feeling was so new, so powerful, it made me want to connect with anyone who had ever felt it. If you've ever found a person or a place that felt more like home than your actual home, please support this story with a like and comment below with the name of the one person who makes you feel completely safe. It's a gift we should all celebrate. The next day, I was sitting on the porch again. Frank came out and sat with me, watching the afternoon sun dapple the leaves of the big oak tree in the yard. He looked over at me, a small kind smile on his face. "You've been carrying the whole world on your shoulders, haven't you?" he said quietly. I could only nod, a lump forming in my throat. He was silent for another moment, then delivered the words that would change everything. "Well," he said, "you can set it down for a while. Around here, you just have to be Izzy." The moment my father's imposing figure was escorted out of the great hall, a vacuum of sound and purpose was left in his wake. The string quartet had fallen silent, their bows frozen over their instruments. The guests, a sea of decorated uniforms and elegant gowns, stood in stunned, awkward clusters, not knowing where to look or what to do. The silence was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket of collective shock and embarrassment. And I was at the epicenter of it, standing alone on a vast expanse of marble, feeling utterly naked. Every eye was a laser beam, fixed on the rapidly purpling bruise on my cheek. I wanted the floor to crack open and swallow me whole. I wanted to disappear. My parents were gone. They had detonated the bomb and simply walked away, leaving me to stand in the wreckage, just as they always had. My entire life had been a series of these moments, them creating a catastrophe, and me, the silent daughter, left to manage the fallout, to smooth things over, to pretend nothing had happened for the sake of peace. But this time, I wasn't entirely alone. As I stood there, trembling, a figure detached from the crowd. It was Major Maria Flores, an officer I'd served with in Afghanistan. She was tough, no nonsense, a woman who had earned her rank through grit and intelligence. She walked directly to me, her face a mask of grim determination. She didn't offer platitudes or ask if I was okay. She simply took off her own dress uniform jacket, the one with the gold oak leaf of a major on the shoulders, and draped it over my bare shoulders. The wool was warm against my cold skin. She leaned in close, her voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos. "I'm here," she whispered. I saw. Two simple words. But they were everything. In a room full of people who had chosen to look away, one person had seen. One person was bearing witness. The weight of her jacket felt like a shield, and for the first time in my life, I felt the strength of solidarity. A quiet, powerful bond that had nothing to do with blood. Just then, Jack returned. He walked past the stunned guests, his eyes only on me. He didn't say, "I'll kill him," or even, "Are you all right?" He did something far more powerful. He knelt on one knee before me, right there on the cold marble floor, taking my trembling hands in his. His grip was gentle but firm, grounding me. He looked directly into my eyes, and in his, I saw not pity, but a reflection of my own strength. And then he asked the question that changed everything. "Izzy," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "what do you want to do now?" The question hit me like a lungful of fresh air after being held underwater. My entire life had been a series of commands, expectations, and duties. I was told what to study, what to wear, who to be. In a crisis, I was told how to react, how to feel, how to clean up the mess. No one, not once, had ever asked me what I wanted. The power of that simple question, the agency it returned to me, was staggering. It was oxygen. I looked at Jack's face, so full of trust and respect. I looked over at Maria, who gave me a firm, almost imperceptible nod. I looked towards the grand doors through which my father had disappeared, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. He had meant to ruin this day, to shatter it so completely that I would have no choice but to crawl back to him, broken. He wanted to prove he still owned me. Brené Brown's words echoed in my mind from the flight. You can choose courage or you can choose comfort, but you cannot choose both. Running away felt like comfort. Hiding felt like comfort. But it was the comfort of a cage. Courage was standing my ground, right here, in the middle of my own beautiful, shattered wedding. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I want to marry you, I whispered, the words feeling fragile but true. A smile touched Jack's lips. It wasn't a happy smile. There was no joy in it. It was a smile of pure, unshakable resolve. He stood, squeezed my hand, and turned to the bewildered officiant, a Catholic priest who looked as if he'd just witnessed an exorcism. Jack's voice rang out, clear and commanding, filling the silent hall. Father, we're ready to proceed. It was the starting gun of my revolution. Our wedding night, in a suite at the Hotel Viking, was nothing like the fairy tale I'd once imagined. There was no romance, no champagne, no laughter. There was only an ice pack from the hotel vending machine, a bottle of Tylenol, and a profound, shared silence. Jack was incredible. He wordlessly helped me out of the heavy gown, which now felt like a costume from another life. He sat me down in front of the vanity mirror and with infinite patience began to remove the dozens of pins that held my intricate hairstyle in place. His large, capable hands, the hands of a soldier, were impossibly gentle as he worked, careful not to pull or cause me any more pain. He didn't fill the silence with empty reassurances or promises of revenge. He just stayed. He was simply present, a calm, steady force in the quiet darkness of the room. And as I sat there, feeling the tension in my scalp release with each removed pin, I had a sudden, heartbreaking realization. For 27 years, after every one of my father's rages, the thrown objects, the slammed doors, the verbal assaults, I had always been left alone to pick up the pieces in silence, to calm myself down, to glue back my own shattered sense of self. Tonight, for the very first time, someone was staying in the silence with me. Someone was sharing the weight of it, and that, I realized, meant more than anything. It was the beginning of healing. For 3 days, there was peace. We had escaped to a small secluded cabin nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina for what was left of our honeymoon. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Our only neighbors were the ancient misty mountains themselves, rolling away in endless blue-gray waves. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, no outside world. We hiked during the day and sat by a crackling fire at night, drinking cheap red wine from coffee mugs. The bruise on my cheek was beginning to fade from a shocking purple to a mottled yellow-green. For the first time, I felt the tight knot of anxiety in my stomach. A companion I'd had since childhood began to loosen its grip. I was starting to believe that a different kind of life was possible. On the 4th day, we had to drive into the nearest small town for supplies. It was a charming little place with a single main street, a general store, and a friendly-looking diner. As we were walking back to the car, my phone, which had been blissfully silent for days, suddenly buzzed to life as it connected to a cell tower. A flood of notifications poured in. And then, it started ringing. The screen lit up with a single word, Mom. Instantly, the peace shattered. The clean mountain air felt thick and hard to breathe. The knot in my stomach cinched tight again, this time with the brutal force of a tourniquet. It felt as if a coil of barbed wire had just been dropped into my gut. Jack saw the look on my face and put a steadying hand on my arm. I took a shaky breath and answered, forcing a neutral tone into my voice. Hi, Mom. Isabel, darling. Oh, thank God, I've been so worried about you. Her voice was a river of warm honey, thick with a manufactured concern that set my teeth on edge. This was her opening move, the one designed to make me feel guilty, to position her as the caring mother and me as the thoughtless daughter. I'm fine, Mom. We just didn't have any service up at the cabin. Of course, she cooed. Well, I'm just so glad you're all right. Your father, well, he deeply regrets how things escalated. You know how he is, the pressure of his career, the ceremony. He just wants what's best for you, sweetheart. He just has a hard time showing it. I felt a familiar, hot wave of anger. She was rewriting history in real time. Not, he regrets punching you in the face. But, he regrets how things escalated, as if it were a passive, unfortunate event, like bad weather, rather than a deliberate act of violence. She was framing him as the victim, a man burdened by pressure, a father whose loving intentions were simply misunderstood. The punch itself had been completely erased from her narrative. I tried to push back, my voice trembling slightly. Mom, he assaulted me, in front of everyone. It wasn't an escalation, it was… She cut me off, her tone shifting instantly from honey to ice. Isabel, do not be dramatic. It was a misunderstanding, and you know you've always been overly sensitive. You embarrassed your father in front of his entire world. You created a truly mortifying scene. And there it was. Gaslighting 101. It was my fault. My reaction was the problem, not his action. My sensitivity was the issue, not his fist. My embarrassment of him was the crime, not his assault on me. For a moment, her words almost worked. A lifetime of conditioning screamed at me to back down, to apologize, to smooth things over. Was I being too sensitive? Did I overreact? The dizzying, disorienting fog of self-doubt began to creep in. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. No, I said, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. No, I didn't create a scene. He did. The silence on the other end of the line was cold and absolute. I had broken the unspoken rule. I had refused to accept the blame. When she spoke again, all pretense of warmth was gone. Her voice was flat, sharp, and dangerous. Your father has spent his entire life building his name, his reputation, she said, each word a carefully aimed dart. You cannot tear that down because of a little hurt feeling. The family is more important than one person's emotions, Isabel. You should know that by now. I felt nauseous. The family. Not a group of people who loved and protected each other, but a brand, a reputation, an entity more valuable than the safety of its own daughter. And then came the final, devastating blow. The checkmate. Jack has a very promising career ahead of him, she said, her voice now dangerously soft. A special forces officer, so much potential. It would be a terrible shame if a few unfavorable remarks from a 2-star general were to find their way into his permanent file. You wouldn't want to be responsible for that, would you, Isabel? The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in the velvet glove of maternal concern. She was holding my husband's future hostage. My stomach churned. This was the ultimate manipulation, forcing me to choose between my own dignity and the career of the man I loved. It was cruel, and it was brilliant. And for a moment, it almost broke me. But then, something else rose up through the fear and the nausea. It was a cold, hard clarity, a rage so pure it felt like ice in my veins. They would never stop. They would use anyone and anything to maintain their control. Jack was just the next tool, the next lever to pull, and I would not let them touch him. My own voice, when I found it, was shaking, but it was clear. It was steady. It was a voice she had never heard before. Do not ever, I said, my words low and precise, call me and threaten my husband again. This conversation is over. And for the first time in 27 years, I hung up on my mother. The click of the phone disconnecting was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a chain snapping. That night, back in the cabin, sleep was an impossibility. The silence of the mountains, which had felt so peaceful just hours before, now felt heavy, charged with unspoken threats. My mother's final words echoed in my head, a repeating loop of velvet-wrapped poison. You wouldn't want to be responsible for that, would you? Fear was a familiar companion. It had been the wallpaper of my childhood, a constant low-grade hum in the background of my life. Fear of my father's temper, fear of my mother's disapproval, fear of not being good enough. I knew its taste, its texture. But tonight, something new was churning alongside it. A cold, hard rage. It was different from the hot, helpless anger I'd felt before. This was a clarifying anger, an anger that burned away the fog of confusion and self-doubt. I realized, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they would never stop. This was not the end. It was just their next tactic. If I gave in, if I buried this for the sake of Jack's career, they would own us both. Jack would become the new leash they used to control me. The cycle of abuse would simply find a new, more insidious form. I looked over at him, sleeping peacefully in the faint moonlight filtering through the window, his face relaxed and free of the world's ugliness. He trusted me. And protecting him, I understood now, meant protecting myself. It meant burning the whole rotten system to the ground. The thought reminded me of a quote from a speech by General Dunford I'd once had to study. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. For 27 years, I had walked past the abuse. I had accepted the silent tyranny, the emotional manipulation, the constant belittling. By staying silent, I had co-signed their behavior. I had accepted it as my standard. Tonight, that ended. Suddenly, I remembered something. The wedding photographer. Amid the chaos after the ceremony, she had pressed a small SD card into my hand. Just in case, she had whispered, her eyes wide. I had shoved it into my purse and forgotten about it until now. I slipped out of bed, my movements quiet and deliberate. In the main room of the cabin, lit only by the pale blue glow of my laptop screen, I found my purse. My fingers closed around the small, cool plastic of the memory card. I slid it into the computer's slot. The drive opened. There were hundreds of photos, beautiful staged images of a perfect day that never was. And then I saw it, a single video file. My breath hitched. The photographer must have set her camera on a tripod to capture the toast and simply let it run. I clicked play. The scene was exactly as I remembered it, but terrifyingly real. The Great Hall, the guests. And there, in crystal-clear high definition, was the entire unforgivable moment. My father's voice, a low, venomous hiss, was perfectly captured by the camera's microphone. The sharp, ugly sound of the punch. My body falling. The collective gasp of the crowd. It was all there. It wasn't just my word against a two-star general's anymore. It was cold, impartial, irrefutable proof. Just as I was about to close the folder, I noticed an unread email in my inbox. It was from a strange, anonymous address. My heart pounded as I opened it. The message was short. Captain Nicholson, I was a lieutenant under your father's command in Iraq. I heard what happened at your wedding. I can't testify officially. I have a family to think about. But I need you to know you are not crazy. We all saw who he was. We were just too afraid to say anything. Be strong. Tears welled in my eyes. It was a message of absolution and condemnation all in one. It confirmed I wasn't the overly sensitive daughter. And it confirmed the terrifying, far-reaching power of the man I had to fight. With a new sense of resolve, I opened a blank document. I began to write. But I wasn't writing as Isabel, the broken daughter. I was writing as Captain Nicholson, an intelligence officer. My training took over. I wrote a formal MFR, a memorandum for record. I detailed the facts and only the facts. Date of wedding. Time, approximately 1540 hours. Location, the Breakers Mansion, Newport, RI. Event, wedding reception of Captain Isabel Nicholson and Captain Jack Monroe. I listed the names of every high-ranking officer I could remember being present as potential witnesses. I described the assault using the precise, sterile language of the UCMJ. Subject, General Harrison Nicholson, engaged in an unprovoked physical assault upon a subordinate officer. I attached the video file. Each word I typed was a brick in a new wall. A wall of truth, a wall they could not tear down. Every keystroke felt like an act of liberation, of reclaiming my own narrative, my own honor. When it was done, I addressed the email. To the Office of the Inspector General, Department of the Army. My finger hovered over the send button. This was it. The point of no return. This single click would detonate my family, end my father's celebrated career, and throw my own future into chaos. I would be trading a quiet, familiar prison for a loud, uncertain war. As I sat there, paralyzed by the enormity of it, a warm hand landed on my shoulder. Jack. He had woken up and come to find me. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't need to. He simply looked at the screen, then back at my face, and his hand on my shoulder tightened with silent, unwavering support. That single touch was all the reinforcement I needed. This is the moment that defines everything. If you believe that standing up for the truth, no matter the cost, is one of the bravest things a person can do, support this story with a like and comment with a simple, "I see you," for everyone who has ever had to fight to be heard. I took one last, deep breath, and I clicked, send. The email vanished into the ether. The cabin was silent again. But this wasn't the silence of fear. It wasn't relief either. It was the strange, calm, terrifying stillness in the eye of a hurricane. I had just broken my vow of silence, and I knew the real storm was just about to begin. After I hit send, the world didn't explode. It went silent. For 2 weeks, the silence was absolute and suffocating. We returned to our life at Fort Bragg, but everything had changed. There was no official reply from the Inspector General's office, no confirmation that my report had even been received. The only feedback we got was from the atmosphere around us. It was a cold front that had moved in overnight. Colleagues who used to greet us with a warm hello now found something intensely interesting to look at on the floor as we passed. Conversations would stop abruptly when we entered a room. Whispers followed us down hallways. We weren't just being ignored, we were being ostracized. We had become untouchable, like lepers in a modern military colony. The system, it seemed, was closing ranks, protecting one of its own. The familiar, gnawing fear began to creep back in, chewing at the edges of my resolve. Had I made a terrible mistake? Had I sacrificed everything for nothing? I found myself replaying my mother's threat, wondering if my father was already making good on his promise to ruin Jack's career. The silence from the command structure was a form of psychological warfare, and I was beginning to lose. Then, one evening, as we were eating a quiet dinner of leftover pizza in our small, sterile apartment on Post, my phone rang. It was a restricted number. My heart leaped into my throat. I answered, my voice barely a whisper. "This is Captain Nicholson." "Captain." A man's voice, formal and devoid of emotion, replied. "This is Major Evans with the Judge Advocate General's Corps. We've received your report. A preliminary inquiry has been opened into the conduct of General Harrison Nicholson." I sank into a kitchen chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Relief washed over me in a dizzying wave. They had heard me. It was real. But then Major Evans said something that changed the entire landscape of the fight. "Captain," he said, his tone still perfectly neutral, "you should know that your report, it appears to have opened a floodgate. In the last 48 hours, we've received 3 other sworn statements regarding the general." I was stunned into silence. Not alone. I was not alone. The words reverberated through my entire being, a seismic shock that shattered years of carefully constructed isolation. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Investigators from the IG's office began to contact me. They were professional, methodical, their questions precise. They showed me redacted copies of the other statements. I was no longer looking at my own isolated trauma. I was looking at a pattern, a meticulously documented history of abuse of power. I read the testimony of a young first lieutenant who my father had verbally eviscerated in front of his entire platoon for a minor mapping error, humiliating him so badly he had considered leaving the army. I read the statement from a logistics specialist, a sergeant first class, who had been systematically denied promotions after she had reported a discrepancy in his travel vouchers. He had quietly and efficiently destroyed her career over a few $100s. I read about his volcanic rages, the objects thrown in his office, the threats, the intimidation. It was like looking at the shards of a shattered mirror, and in every broken piece, I saw a reflection of my own pain. I had always thought I was the sole target of his private wars. The truth was, he had left a battlefield of broken soldiers in his wake. The most powerful story came from a retired female colonel. She had been on the fast track to making brigadier general a decade ago. In a planning meeting, she had respectfully disagreed with my father on a strategic point. He didn't argue. He simply smiled. Weeks later, a negative performance review, citing her inability to work as part of a command team, mysteriously appeared in her file, effectively killing her chances for promotion. She told the investigators, her voice shaking with a decade of suppressed rage, "I stayed silent for 10 years because I thought that was the price of survival. Captain Nicholson showed me the true price of that silence, and I'm not willing to pay it anymore." My single act of defiance had become a catalyst. It had given others the courage to step out of the shadows. It was a domino effect, a chain reaction of truth that, once started, could not be stopped. A week later, we were assigned a military lawyer from the JAG Corps. We met her in a small windowless office. Major Hannah Rostova was not a warm, reassuring presence. She was sharp, intense, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through you. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She laid it out for us in stark, unflinching terms. "General Nicholson is not going to go down quietly," she said, her voice crisp. "He's going to use every ounce of his influence, every connection he has, to paint you as a liar. An unstable, vindictive daughter with an axe to grind. He will try to discredit you, humiliate you, and break you on the stand." She leaned forward, her gaze locking onto mine. "Our fight isn't just about proving his guilt. It's about defending your character. From this moment on, you are no longer the victim. You are the primary witness in a legal battle. You need to be prepared. Are you?" Her words were like a splash of ice water. She wasn't offering comfort, she was offering a mission. She was handing me a weapon and a strategy. She was pulling me out of the role of the hurt daughter and placing me squarely in the role I knew best. A soldier preparing for a fight. "Yes, ma'am," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm ready." A few days later, she called. "It's official," she said, her tone all business. "The commanding general has reviewed the preliminary inquiry. He's determined there's credible evidence to proceed. An Article 32 hearing has been scheduled." The finality of it settled in. This was no longer a family drama. It was a formal, legal proceeding. A stage was being set for a confrontation, and the curtain was about to rise. The Article 32 hearing was held at Fort Myer, Virginia, in a formal hearing room that felt more like a courtroom. The space was designed to intimidate. It was paneled in dark, imposing mahogany, the air thick with the scent of floor wax and the heavy weight of military justice. The American flag and the Army flag stood sentinel in the corner. This was the heart of the institution my father had dedicated his life to, and it was the stage for his undoing. He sat at the respondents' table, directly across from me. He was in his full Class A uniform, the chest so crowded with ribbons and medals it looked like a shield of honor. For the first time in my life, he wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed straight ahead on the presiding officer, his jaw set, projecting an aura of aggrieved dignity. My mother sat in the row directly behind him, her posture perfect, her face a blank, emotionless mask of porcelain. She looked like a statue. I sat beside Hannah, my own hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. But my back was straight, my uniform was perfectly pressed, my gaze was steady. As I looked at the man across from me, I realized with a jolt that I wasn't afraid. The frightened little girl who used to tremble in his study was gone. In her place sat Captain Isabel Nicholson, and she was ready. The hearing proceeded with methodical precision. Witnesses were called, testimonies were given. But the turning point, the moment the atmosphere in the room shifted irrevocably, was when Hannah announced, The government calls its next exhibit a video recording of the event in question. A large screen was wheeled to the front of the room. The lights were dimmed. The silent, grainy footage of my wedding reception filled the screen. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the projector. Then, the audio kicked in. My father's voice, a venomous hiss, clear as a bell in the silent room. Desk-bound disappointment. The sharp, ugly crack of the impact. My own shocked gasp as I fell. The video played for only 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I didn't watch the screen. I watched my father. I saw the muscle in his jaw clench, a tiny telltale sign of his fury. I saw the confident, arrogant posture begin to sag, just slightly, under the weight of his own actions being played back for the world to see. The monument was cracking. When the lights came up, the presiding officer, a stern-faced colonel, simply stared at the blank screen for a long moment. The video had said it all. Then it was my turn to testify. My father's civilian lawyer, an expensive suit from a DC firm, approached me with a condescending smile. He was clearly going for the hysterical daughter angle. "Captain Nicholson," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "isn't it true that you and your father have always had a difficult relationship?" "No, sir," I replied, my voice calm and even, just as Hannah had coached me. He looked surprised. "No? You would characterize your relationship as a good one." "I would characterize it as abusive, sir." A murmur went through the room. The lawyer's smile faltered. He tried a different tack. "Isn't it true, Captain, that you've always been somewhat jealous of your father's legacy? That perhaps this is just a way to get attention?" I looked him straight in the eye. "Sir, I have a relationship where I was physically and emotionally abused. That is not difficult. That is a crime." I refused to be drawn into a debate about my feelings. I stuck to the facts, the abuse, the assault, the pattern. His attempts to paint me as an emotional, unreliable woman fell flat against the cold, hard wall of my military bearing. His final attempt was one of pure desperation. He turned to the presiding officer. "Sir, what we have here is not an assault. It is the unfortunate, perhaps clumsy reaction of a loving father, worried about his daughter on her wedding day." Before the officer could even respond, Hannah stood up. "Objection," she said, her voice like ice. She didn't wait for a ruling. She looked directly at the lawyer. "A concerned father hugs his daughter," she said, her voice ringing with contempt. "A bully punches her. Please do not insult the intelligence of this hearing by confusing the two." The lawyer retreated, his face flushed. The room was silent. But the final nail in my father's coffin was hammered in by the man himself. The retired colonel, the one who had written me the email, gave a powerful, damning testimony about his career sabotage. Other witnesses corroborated a long history of tyranny. Finally, my father was called to the stand. It was his chance to show remorse, to offer a defense. Instead, he chose to attack. He launched into a furious, rambling tirade about loyalty, about sacrifice, about the ungratefulness of a new generation. He spoke of his legacy, his honor, and the betrayal of his own flesh and blood. His voice, which had always commanded respect and fear, was now just the angry shouting of a playground bully who had finally been challenged. And in that moment, in front of the very system he had weaponized for so long, his mask didn't just slip, it shattered. The room saw him not as a decorated general, but as the raging, abusive man the witnesses had described. They saw the man from the video. I realized then that he wasn't defeated by my evidence or by the other testimonies. He was defeated by his own reflection. He was undone by the one thing he could never control, his own true self. After he was dismissed, there was a brief recess. I didn't see him leave the room. The next time I saw him was only in a photograph, days later. It was a sterile, official photo showing a man I barely recognized, standing stoically as another officer gently, methodically, removed the 2 silver stars from his collar. The monument had finally fallen. The final verdict came down not with a bang, but with a quiet, formal email. My father was to be forcibly retired, stripped of 1 star. A public and permanent stain on a flawless record. The war was over. I had won. But I didn't feel like a victor. There was no surge of elation, no triumphant fist pump. There was only a profound and overwhelming emptiness. That evening, Jack found me sitting on the floor of our darkened living room, staring at a blank wall. He didn't say anything, just sank down to the floor beside me, his solid presence a familiar comfort. After a long silence, I spoke, my voice feeling rusty and foreign. I spent my entire life fighting a war I never chose, and now that it's over, I don't know what to do with the peace. It was a strange kind of grief. I was mourning the loss of the fight itself, because for so long, the fight was all I had. It had defined me. Without the looming shadow of my father to push against, who was I? A week later, a letter arrived. The envelope was thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind my mother favored. My name was written on the front in her perfect, elegant cursive. For a fleeting, foolish moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. The apology. The acknowledgement. The olive branch. I opened it. The letter was 5 pages long, every line filled with her flawless script, and not a single word was an apology. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic rage, a detailed account of her own suffering. She wrote of the shame she had endured, the humiliation of facing her friends at the Newport Country Club. She wrote of how I had selfishly destroyed the family name, a name that generations had worked to build. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, a loyal wife whose life had been ruined by her ungrateful, destructive daughter. The final paragraph was the one that finally broke me. I can only hope, she wrote, that one day, when you have a family of your own, you will finally understand the true cost of your selfishness. Perhaps then you will feel a fraction of the pain you have caused me. I let the letter fall from my fingers, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I cried. Not the hot, angry tears of the past, but a deep, sorrowful, gut-wrenching sob. I wasn't crying because of her hateful words. I was crying for the mother I never had. I was crying for the little girl inside me who had never stopped hoping that one day, if she was just good enough, just smart enough, just quiet enough, her mother would finally see her, would finally protect her. That letter was the final, brutal confirmation that the woman I'd been hoping for simply didn't exist. I was mourning the death of an illusion I'd clung to for 27 years. When the tears finally stopped, a strange calm settled over me. I picked up the letter, walked into the kitchen, and held it over the stainless steel sink. I took a lighter from the utility drawer and set a corner of the thick cardstock on fire. I watched as the flames consumed her elegant, wounding words, turning them into black, curling ash. It wasn't an act of anger, it was a ritual. A funeral for a hope that needed to die so that I could finally live. The door to that part of my life, I decided, was now closed and locked forever. The weeks that followed were quiet and reflective. The noise of the battle was gone, and in the stillness, Jack and I began to talk about the future in a way we never had before. One evening, as we were sitting on our small balcony, watching the sunset paint the North Carolina sky in shades of orange and purple, Jack asked me a simple question. When you think about the future, Izzy, what do you see? I closed my eyes, trying to picture it, and for the first time, the towering, oppressive shadow of my father wasn't there. The space he had occupied in my mind for so long was just empty. But I also saw the uniform. I saw the rigid structure of the army, the rules, the regulations, the constant need to prove myself in a system that had shaped my entire adult life. You know, I said slowly, the thought forming as I spoke, the army gave me so much. It gave me a purpose, a structure, it gave me you. But it was also his world. I followed him into it, trying to earn his respect. I think I need to find a world of my own. Jack was quiet for a long time, just watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon. Then he turned to me, his face serious in the twilight. I'll go with you, wherever that is, he said simply. The idea, once spoken aloud, took root. The thought of leaving the military was terrifying. It was the only identity I'd ever known outside of being a Nicholson. But it was also thrilling. Our decision to submit our resignations wasn't an act of running away. It was a conscious choice to step off a path that had been chosen for us, and to start clearing a new one for ourselves. I thought of my uniform, hanging in the closet. It had been my armor for so long, a protective shell that I had built around myself. It had kept me safe, but it had also kept me contained. Now, it felt too tight, too restrictive. It was preventing me from breathing, from growing. Taking it off for the last time wouldn't be a surrender. It would be the final act of liberation, reclaiming my autonomy not just from my parents, but from the entire system that had defined us both. It was time to find out who Isabel was without the armor. We found our world in a small town just outside Madison, Wisconsin. We bought a modest farmhouse with a wide front porch and enough land for a sprawling, chaotic garden. For the first time, life wasn't about surviving, it was about cultivating. I discovered a simple, profound joy in sinking my hands into the dark, rich soil, in watching tomato plants climb their stakes, their scent sharp and green in the humid summer air. I found peace in the ritual of a morning coffee on the porch swing, watching the sunrise without the familiar dread of what the day might bring. There were no landmines here, no ambushes, just the quiet, steady rhythm of a life being built. Out in the old barn, Jack created a small woodworking shop. The sound of his saw cutting through lumber, the rhythmic tap of a chisel, became the soundtrack to our new beginning. He was creating things, beautiful, solid, functional pieces of furniture. It was the opposite of the life we had left behind, a life of destruction and deconstruction. Here, we were building. A few months after we moved in, we visited the local animal shelter. In a back corner, curled into a tight ball, was a scruffy terrier mix named Buster. The shelter volunteer told us he had been badly abused and was terrified of everyone. When I looked into his cage, he didn't bark or growl. He just trembled, his big, brown eyes filled with a fear I recognized. "He's the one," I said to Jack. Bringing Buster home was a lesson in patience. For the first month, he hid under the kitchen table, refusing to come out. I didn't try to force him. I would just bring my book and a cup of tea and sit on the kitchen floor a few feet away from his hiding spot, reading aloud in a calm, steady voice. I wanted him to get used to my presence, to understand that I was not a threat. I never reached for him. I let him come to me. The day it happened, I was sitting on the floor as usual. After an hour of silence, I felt a tentative, wet nose nudge my hand. I stayed perfectly still. He nudged me again, then slowly, cautiously, he crept out from under the table and laid his head in my lap. His body was still tense, but he was there. Tears streamed down my face. I understood him. We were both learning to trust again. We were both learning that not all hands were meant to strike. As my own world became quieter, I found myself wanting to help others find their voice. I started reading the works of Maya Angelou, and her words resonated deep in my soul. There was one quote I wrote down and taped to my bathroom mirror. "Each time a woman stands up for herself, she stands up for all women." I had stood up for myself. Now, I felt a deep need to help other women stand up too. I began volunteering at a local community center that ran support groups for female veterans. I wasn't a therapist or a counselor. I was just a facilitator, someone to hold the space. My greatest skill, the one I had honed over a lifetime of silent, careful observation, was listening. And so, I listened. I listened to stories of harassment, of assault, of being overlooked and underestimated, of the unique trauma that women face in the military. I didn't offer advice. I just offered a safe place for their stories to land. I offered them the two words that Maria Flores had given me: "I see you." 2 years after that chaotic day in Newport, on our wedding anniversary, Jack and I drove back. We didn't go to the breakers. We didn't go anywhere near the opulent mansions of our past. Instead, we drove out to the Castle Hill Lighthouse, a simple, steadfast stone tower, standing guard over the entrance to the bay. It was just the two of us, standing on the cliffs with the wind whipping our hair and the salty spray on our faces. We weren't wearing fancy clothes, just jeans and warm sweaters. We hadn't come to relive a memory, but to create a new one. We had written new vows for each other, not on fancy stationery, but on scraps of notebook paper. Jack read his words about partnership, about building a life of quiet strength together, bringing fresh tears to my eyes. Then, I unfolded my own. My voice was clear and strong, carried on the wind out to the sea. I ended with a new promise, not just to him, but to myself. I vow to never be silent again, I said, looking into his eyes. And I vow to always, always listen to my own voice. It was the reclamation of a vow I'd been forced to break on our first wedding day. The final scene of my story isn't about me, it's about what came after. A few months later, I was sitting in the circle at the Veterans Center. A young woman, a former Marine who hadn't spoken a single word in the group for weeks, suddenly cleared her throat. The room went quiet. Hesitantly at first, and then with growing confidence, she began to tell her story. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer advice. I just sat there and listened. I nodded. I held the space for her, creating a circle of safety where her truth could finally be heard. As she spoke, a small, quiet smile touched my lips. A smile not of victory, but of peace, of completeness. I had found my world. And in this world I had built, a world made of quiet mornings and rescued dogs and circles of strong women, I was no longer just healing myself. I was helping others begin their own journey toward the sunrise. My story found its sunrise, but I know that for many, the dawn is still breaking. The most important lesson I learned is that our voices, no matter how quiet, have power when we finally choose to use them. This channel is a space for stories like that, stories of strength, survival, and the quiet courage it takes to heal. If you believe in the power of these stories, please subscribe and become part of our community. Share this with one person who might need a reminder that their voice matters too. Thank you for listening.